How do we innovate competition in pharmacy?
So I like, I'm going to keep coming back to Mark Cuban because he's an industry outsider, and came in with fresh thinking as to how do we address the issue with, overpriced, I would say overpriced drugs. The cost of
Overpriced and unfair in terms of we don't know where those prices are coming from,
we
right?
don't know
So
whether
lack of completely opaque, right?
exactly. So
Hi, Rondo. How are you today?
hey, Matt, I'm well. How about you?
Well, I'm good. We're going to talk about pharmacy today and get a sense of disruption in pharmacy and kind of apply the insurgent mindset to the pharmacy ecosystem. So I think it'll be really interesting to look at this part of the economy, which is really poised for some significant disruption.
Yeah. I don't know. You maybe remember that I started my professional career in the pharmaceutical industry. And at one point, when I was in my old pharmaceutical days, I actually worked in a national accounts area. And I got to, this was back in the mid to late 80s, work with one of the innovations in pharmacy at the time, which was mail order pharmacies. So it'll be interesting to talk about them and their evolution in the context of the whole pharmacy market continuum over the next couple of minutes.
Okay, terrific. Now we have one foot in each side of the world here, where I'm sitting in Sydney, Australia, you're sitting in New York, and we really have two different health systems. So we'll try to do to the best of our ability a bit of a dive in each of these areas. But Rhonda, why don't you kick us off? What signaled this topic area to make pharmacy an interesting sort of line of inquiry for us?
Well, I know I've been watching the news over the past couple of months, and especially I would say during the pandemic and over the last couple of months, hearing about some of the moves that CVS, now CVS Health, has been making. So moving beyond its traditional roots of, I would say, pharmacy into other aspects of healthcare, even including healthcare delivery and clinics. And that sparked another conversation in terms of on the pharmacy side about what Mark Cuban has been doing with his new company that was launched in 2020 called Cost Plus Drugs. And we started to have this conversation around whether that was really being Mark Cuban's company was really being more insurgent, and whether some of the more retail chains like the CVS here or the Walgreens are still operating more like incumbent organizations.
Okay. Well, you've introduced a few things. So we have a kind of a classic incumbent, CVS, Walgreens, and we have a challenger with Mark Cuban and his crowd, maybe Amazon and a few others trying to kind of disrupt the order of the industry a little bit. Just to set the table, we'll start with North America. CVS is the market leader, roughly 20% market share of an almost $5 billion market. Walgreens number two at roughly 15%. So we're looking at 90 million plus or minus and 75 million for Walgreens, thousands of stores, tens of thousands of employees, vertically integrated models into PBM and also into insurance. So in some sense, these are, the classic incumbents, which are, the big, fat, lazy kind of competitors ripe for some disruption, at least on the margins. Is that a fair
Hmm.
characterization?
That's fair. That's fair. They make up, I would say, the retail pharmacy component of the market. There's also I think a third of that retail are independent pharmacies, so we don't want to ignore them. And then there's a smaller group of specialty pharmacies as well.
Right. So, but still with 35 or 40% of the market wrapped up with two big retailers, it looks, you know, pretty concentrated as an industry. So, all right. So let's peel the onion a little bit. So the news you mentioned, CVS is, shedding workforce. I read
Yeah.
something recently that suggested that they're considering breaking up the vertically integrated structure and sort of running that as at least three, maybe four different companies. So there's a lot of speculation about that. What's paring back the marginal demand for pharmacy, for the traditional model, at least in big pharmacy?
That's a good question. I think that there's a lot of pricing pressure. People are pushing back, both insurers are pushing back on the price of drugs. So not only at the pharmaceutical level, but they're squeezing, the PBMs and the retail chains are being squeezed on the margins in terms of what they can make on these drugs. In fact, I think you and I were talking about this, that 75% of the revenue that is generated in retail pharmacies comes from branded drugs, but they're only about 10% or so of the volume in retail pharmacies. So I think they continue to be squeezed on the margins that they can make on those branded drugs, which are cutting into their profitability.
Hmm. And there's other background factors too. There's sort of a decline also in front of shop in terms of traditional retail, and pharmacy is down as obviously costs have continued to increase through the pandemic, which is problematic. People feeling that inflation as well. People are perhaps not as active in terms of buying supplements and other things as discretionary income is squeezed. So, overall, it's not great. But then I think it's really interesting on the margins um, with the likes of Amazon and now these online retailers, which I think it's interesting also to note that the penetration of online in pharmacy is much lower than other parts of the economy. It's, sort of one of the last cabs off the rank, if you will. I
Hmm.
think it's interesting to kind of look at these things all kind of coming together. So you have marginal demand on the consumer side sort of ebbing, but now we have the rise of these substitutes that have come on, which are, sort of approaching almost 10% market share in these alternative business models, particularly trying to upset pharmacy distribution, last mile, disintermediate the PBM, which is a key factor, give customers or consumers more choice and control, provide options and transparency to your point, independent pharmacy. So there's a lot happening in this space, but it really hasn't reached scale yet. And what's your prediction in terms of how this might evolve?
Well, I think that, people are going to gravitate toward the convenience of the online models. I think it may take a little more time, but I think I can see especially when you have a player like Amazon Pharmacy there, I think that people over time will eventually gravitate more toward that kind of a model. I know, for example, that I use an online delivery service for pharmacy for several of my medications. I don't have to go to the pharmacy for that. And it's just a lot more convenient. So I do believe that you're going to see that continual shift. The question is, when will you get that tipping point where you would see that big switch from, the more traditional retail pharmacy to the more digital and online delivery models?
Now, Rondo, it's not just digital. There are alternative players, particularly Walmart, who's gone heavy into pharmacy as well, where, sort of the one-stop shop for all of your household needs, including pharmacy,
Hmm.
the Krogers of the world and so forth. So
Right.
pharmacy has become much less um, delineated as a model and is now a hybrid in these other channels. And of course, also the Walmarts of the world are competing online as well. So it's a bit of a mess, really, in terms of all these different competitors coming at the market from different perspectives.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because when I think about the Walmarts and others, Kroger's, et cetera, I see them, using the pharmacy as somewhat of a loss leader, especially as it relates to generic drugs that they may sell. So they can sell, and that's what's also causing, I think, challenges for some of the other retailers, is that those kinds of organizations can use them as a loss leader to get people into their grocery store or into the Walmart, because then they'll buy other things. So I think that that's also what's causing a lot more pricing pressure across the industry because of innovations like that from a Walmart and Kroger's, et cetera. But the other thing is, when I look at that, I'm still looking at that as the retail model. That's still the, pharmacy retail model you have to go in. I do believe that consumers are going to increasingly look for more convenient opportunities. And the other thing that I think is going to be important is this whole issue of that the Mark Cuban is leaning into is the transparency in pricing, which has
Mhm.
always been a problem
Yeah,
for the pharmaceutical industry. You know, the PBMs in terms of how they price it, this is so much complexity there. So the more that you can show consumers, you know, what you paid for a drug and how much you're marking it up, and they can see that, have that transparency around pricing, I think that's going to be an attractive draw going forward.
right. Okay, so when we talk about disruption, we always lay out that where to look, Rondo, for industries that are ripe for disruption or change. Transparency is one of those key elements where the consumer or even the pharmacy, in this case, particularly the independent pharmacy, has lack of transparency and understanding how the pricing works, or
Hmm.
there's some discontinuity in the market in terms of confusion that the consumer might have, or there's just a pent-up lack of satisfaction in the current model, makes the situation where consumers will fight back, and others like Mark Cuban and Amazon, et cetera, will start to cobble together these alternative models. But I don't know that. I think you brought up an interesting point about retail. But I think it's interesting to your point, if Walmart and others are using pharmacy as a loss leader to drive traffic in their traditional businesses, that doesn't change the fact that that's a compelling competitive alternative for consumers to participate in pharmacy in another place, which puts more pressure on those incumbents like CVS and Walgreens.
Absolutely.
True.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't change the fact that it's affecting their margins, and it puts their current incumbent business models under some threat as both the unit economics start to break down, and as the Cubans of the world get more scale, they'll be able to then penetrate or potentially into other aspects of the pharmaceutical value chain.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a Walmart customer and you that's where you shop, it's so much more convenient to do your pharmacy there as well. You know, why
Hmm.
would you want to make a separate trip to a pharmacy if you have a Walmart pharmacy there and you see that you probably can get even better prices
Right.
as well.
Now, in this case, though, coming back to sort of the insurgent mindset, clearly CVS, Walgreens, and the large incumbent pharmacies are not taking this sitting down, right? So they are fighting back. I know CVS in particular has created a Me Too sort of alternative to the Mark Cuban model. I know that in many cases whilst they are trying to readjust their cost structures, they are fighting back.
Hmm. Yeah, but
So
I mean, I do give them credit for evolving from the traditional pharmacy model. I mean, they had to think beyond, okay, we can't just be pill dispensers. You know, how do we continue to evolve? Moving into healthcare was a big, I think, evolution for them. So that I give them credit for thinking about innovation that way and being agile in that way.
that's
But
what I was looking for, Rondo, because I
yeah.
think there's also a bigger play here, another play where, and whether we're in Australia or in the US, I suppose, there's a crunch. There's fewer and fewer general practitioners available.
Mhm.
The healthcare system is more and more overwhelmed. And of course, pharmacy does provide a potential and compelling alternative for frontline health. And it's a little bit ahead in the US in terms of, for example, many pharmacies have created urgent care or mini surgeries or vaccination
Mhm.
hubs, whatever it might be. So we're also seeing traditional retail pharmacy challenge a little bit the traditional doctor surgery. So that's a shift as well. It's sort of a rebalancing of healthcare a little bit. And we're really not just talking about pharmacy. We're talking about frontline health in some ways as well.
Yeah, but I also want to put in a plug for telehealth and online pharmacy because I think the pandemic helped to really get people comfortable with receiving healthcare that way. I mean, a lot of times have to go to a doctor that's just because they want to read test results to me. Well, we can do that virtually. I don't need to come in your office to have you review my, test results and my records unless you're going to actually examine me, or do some blood draws or something like that, then it doesn't really make sense. So when I look at companies like Hims and Hers that are really telehealth, they actually prescribe medicine and dispense the medicine as well. I think that's a nice innovation, and I believe that we're going to see more of that because we had to go use those kinds of services a lot more during the pandemic.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So just a moment on the Australian market. I think it's a very different model here. We have a single payer system for the most part. Pharmacies are typically pharmacies. The way the pharmacy model here is structured, in most states, there's a regulated limit to the number of pharmacies that can be owned by a single owner, which
Mm.
then creates a situation where the concentration of the market is hasn't quite happened to the same degree that it has in the US, but typically these banner groups like in Australia, Chemist Warehouse and the EBOS Group and others have created these brands which coalesce a number of different pharmacies together into they call them banner groups, but basically they're like big buying groups or branded groups, which front to the consumer as a single entity, but that's not necessarily how it works in the back end. And then there's a very powerful small number of wholesaler distribution companies that sort of sit in between pharma and the pharmacy, very similar to the way it's structured there. But
Hmm.
fundamentally, those rules on ownership and government and the government rules dictating discounting, which are very, very, very tight, limit the degrees of freedom of pharmacy to be able to compete on the behind the counter and to a lesser degree the front of counter um, part of the pharmacy story. So also we have much less freedom of pharmacies to be able to offer frontline health. And there's very powerful lobbies. The pharmacy lobby is governed by the Pharmacy Guild here, and of course, on the other side of it, the AMA and other peak bodies are really strong lobbying for the general practice. So the market is artificially not competitive, really, at some level. I mean, it's hyper competitive on high street, but if you add that back to high street, if you add that in, it's also legislated that you can't open a new pharmacy within a certain distance of existing pharmacies. So it's very difficult to sort of navigate. So new entrants to the market, it's very similar to the way taxi licenses used to be set up, where in order to get permission to compete, the price of that competition is built in. You're almost purchasing a license to compete. So
Hmm.
it makes it very hard for new entrants to compete. So over the years, we've seen, challenges upstream in terms of direct to pharmacy models where the big pharmas are trying to disintermediate the wholesalers. We've seen relatively limited innovation um, on online pharmacy, and what does exist is sort of um, really emulating pharmacy front of shop and not really not certainly not behind the counter. And I suppose the only other big change is robotics in pharmacy. Sort of, they used to talk about, the sort of lick and stick role of the pharmacist, where that's now being replaced by machines, and some of the bigger pharmacies are handling that. And I think I mentioned to you also, we've got e-scripting here as well that goes direct from the general practitioner to the consumer, which streamlines the consumer experience, at least in terms of presenting their scripts, no more, not no more, but gradually phasing out paper. So there's a lot of change, but the structure of the industry really hasn't been disrupted, and
Right.
we'll see how it plays out. But the banner groups have consolidated a lot of the branding at least, and certainly the buying power upstream. But I think that if any of those changes, if any of those three big things, pharmacy location, number of owners, and discounting, if those kind of key baseline assumptions were overturned, we'd see almost a wholesale disruption of pharmacy in Australia. So we'll see how it plays out. For now, the powers that are sort of holding those changes at bay are pretty significant. And one more point, I suppose, is also
Hmm.
we don't have legislative ability to offer, for example, pharmacy in supermarkets, are sort of our equivalents of the Walmarts or the Krogers being, Kohl's and Woolworths in this market. So, there's still a lot of change. So what does the pharmacy owner need to do to sort of survive is find different ways to differentiate, which, feels a lot more traditional in terms of its competitive sort of dynamic. But,
Right.
we're all looking to some of the big changes happening in the US to see whether, fundamentally these changes pass through to the consumer. Is the consumer getting a better deal from, for example, the Amazons of the world, or is that just cost shifting to a different model?
So if the pharmacies there are unable to really compete on price because it's regulated, right? The cost of the medicine is pretty regulated. What are
There's
the
some, well,
areas
you
of
can compete on price in a sense of, um, for grocery or front of house goods, you can
front of
compete on
house goods, right?
there,
But not the
cosmetic,
not the medications.
deodorant, whatever, all that kind of stuff. Supplements, which is a big category, so you can compete there. There are some limited, um, like for example, health checks and cholesterol and things like that. So there are some limited frontline health opportunities here, but the regulation and behind the counter is quite stringent and strict, and the degree of discounting is very low. I think
Yeah.
you can discount up to $1. It used to be more, but that creates a problem too because it accelerates, without getting into how the dynamics work. But there's a cap in terms of once that cap is exceeded, then all the medication is free for PBS goods. So that's once that cap is exceeded, then consumers enjoy a significant benefit. But by discounting, it takes longer for consumers to be able to reach the cap. So it's pretty complex in terms of how it all works. But
So
back
what's
to
so what's the primary dimension through by which companies actually differentiate themselves? And when you think of a pharmacy there, which pharmacy would you say has been the most differentiated and is being rewarded because of it?
Well, I think there are different models, Rondo. So, and like in any industry, there's a cost leader, and that'd probably be Chemist Warehouse, where they're really focused um, on the discount and really focused on everyday low price model, if you will. Um, then we have a number of different pharmacies focused more on, if you will, the nutraceutical side, naturopaths,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of the health and well-being kind of differentiation story there, which there's a significant slice of the pharmacy model working there. Then, since differentiation in pharmacy is often very much about location, we have others that are very strategic in terms of where they place their pharmacies, to make sure that they're after the right demographic, for example, which offers opportunities to upshift the margins and things like that. So it feels pretty traditional. It's very segmented, and the incumbents, are, I guess, the choice for most of the pharmacies, at least the independent pharmacies, is do they go into one of these banner groups to access the sort of the upstream buying benefits and the brand sort of support that you might get, the advertising and marketing support that you might get from the banner groups,
Mm-hmm.
promotions, et cetera, or do you maintain independence and sort of compete as a main street pharmacy, which is becoming increasingly difficult. So,
Right.
I think these challenges are that's the challenge of most pharmacies in Australia is, um, if you're a small group, which might comprise maybe 50, 100, 150 pharmacies, or if you're an independent, how do you create meaningful differentiation and what's available to you to compete? And the incumbents are largely governed by, these corporate banner groups, which, de facto own all the means of production in pharmacy and guide and limit the pharmacy owners to, these contracts that they're locked into on buying and in particular on branding. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't leave that much open for group pharmacies to do something different if they want to.
Yeah. So something to think we have to think about here in the U.S. is, now with a new administration coming in January, and I know that the Republicans have, at least when during Trump's first term, really wanted to try to figure out how to remove, if not make changes to the Affordable Care Act. What they will do in that regard in this next 4 years, and what implications might that have for pharmacy dispensing and pharmacies in general? I don't know. I don't know how largely that Affordable Care Act has focused on, insurers and, premiums, but there could be something in that because there's been a lot of um, concern about the price of drugs. And I think the current Biden administration had negotiated a deal, at least for Medicare patients, for I think it was a panel of 10 drugs to get them reduced costs. One of them being insulin. Insulin went to $35 a month for Medicare patients. And I think in 2026, those prices are supposed to be extended across the board, regardless of whether you're a Medicare or not. And
Mm,
there were supposed to be other drugs that were going to move into the negotiation phase. So I'm not sure if the intent of this new administration will be to continue those conversations, and that could have an impact on some of the returns that pharmacies are receiving or seeing from their branded drugs, mostly from the branded drugs, but also from some of those generic drugs as well.
mm. I think that we'll see how it plays out, but fundamentally we gotta work back from the consumer. Prices are perceived to be too high across all of pharmacy categories. So that's a factor consumers will keep pushing back on and vote with their feet. Where significant cost advantages can be carved out of the traditional model, which is a complex model. There's a lot of people clipping the ticket on the way through that model, which
Mhm.
to your point about the cost plus model is really trying to drive out some of those costs. But like I said before, it's going to be a matter of just achieving some scale there. Um, so, from a mindset point of view, like if we just come back to the theme of the podcast, um, how would you sort of unpack your advice to incumbent or an insurgent leader in this environment? Where would you be looking for opportunities, and how can we help these business owners think a little bit differently about their competition? How do we innovate competition in pharmacy?
So I'm going to keep coming back to Mark Cuban because he's an industry outsider, and came in with fresh thinking as to how do we address the issue with, overpriced, I would say overpriced drugs. The cost of
Overpriced and unfair in terms of we don't know where those prices are coming from,
we
right?
don't know
So
whether
lack of completely opaque, right?
Exactly. So I think that there's going to be more emphasis on how do we continue to make that more consumer focus. You know, Amazon with what it's doing, because it has that substantial distribution network, can play a big role in that. So I do believe that the retail part of the chains is going to continue to be disrupted, especially as it relates to the generic piece. I don't know what more they can do from the branded side of things. I do know that when I was in the industry years ago, one of the things that then mail service companies or mail order businesses did was they contracted directly with pharma companies to get, rebates because they leverage their formularies, which is a list of products that their insurers will reimburse for, that they leverage that as a way to negotiate better deals with pharma companies through rebates. I don't know if they're continuing to do more of that to help them, but I do believe that pharma, because of what's happening on the pharmacy side, pharma's going to continue to feel pressure. So once the pharma companies continue to feel that pressure to either, find innovative ways to lower their prices or provide more rebates, I think that ultimately needs to get passed back on to the consumers through models like the cost plus drugs.
Mm. Yeah. So in that sense, it's a traditional disruption story of find a different cost curve, pass that on to the consumer, undermine sort of the marginal customer until you build scale, and then progressively push into the market. So that sort of makes sense. Um, I think that there's still more opportunity for differentiation in the existing model, and in the long term, um, I see big opportunities for pharmacy to play a more significant role in frontline health. Um, it is one of the most trusted categories of professional in the economy. People love their pharmacist. The pharmacist's role needs to shift from being more about lick and stick and providing, the transactional elements of pharmacy, and then offering more advice and more engagement to consumers or patients to help them think more about wellness and health. That shift will play a key role, and I think that there is, tremendous opportunities for pharmacies to, sort of occupy at least part of that story to alleviate some of the pressure in other parts of the healthcare system. So I think that's interesting,
Yeah.
and I think that, and then I think kind of ongoing differentiation in terms of thinking about new opportunities to um, create a more nuanced sort of differentiation in the market beyond just cost or health or whatever. I think there's more opportunities to see categories to compete um, where consumers feel underserved rather
Right.
than just focusing on commodity categories like milk or eggs, bread, butter, whatever it is. I think, there is a huge, in the wellness space, there's a huge burgeoning market where everything from energy drinks um, I don't know, Chinese medicine, et cetera, are,
Hmm.
are looking for a home. And I think pharmacy could play a key role in some of that. So I think it's
I
sort of
love that. I love that vision.
well, I think it's inevitable. It has to be because, there's a supply constraint on minting new doctors, new general practice doctors, particularly in Australia, but
Oh, we have an issue here as
that
well.
isn't
Yeah.
growing. And as we continue with the demographic bubble and the pervasiveness of chronic disease, et cetera, the system will continue to come under pressure. So I see more opportunity for pharmacies to occupy their space in that health kind of ecosystem, even while they're being disrupted on the cost side. So it's really a story of differentiation, right?
Right.
How do you make that pivot where pharmacies can level up their value add in terms of health and obviously capture the economic value of that, even while being undermined at the bottom end as the cost pluses of the world take, tens, 20, 30% of the cost out of the structure. And I guess ultimately, this whole industry, both in Australia and the US, is largely based on a very small number of assumptions that could be overturned, right? In your case, if, for example, someone by the stroke of a pen decided that, full transparency was required about all this pricing, then that would create a huge shakeup in the American model pretty quickly. That ability to see the detail of these contracts all the way up and down the value chain would fundamentally alter the situation competitively. And as I mentioned before here, there's just a few things in terms of the structure of pharmacy is heavily dependent on um, um, being stuck in a lane that doesn't allow them to compete outside of the traditional pharmacy environment for
Right.
fear of disrupting, for example, general practice. I think that'll be inevitable. That'll have to be overturned. Location, discounting, and a few other things. If those get overturned, then we'll have a major disruption. The real question is the consumer satisfied with the current pharmacy model, and do they know any different?
Right. And I think, and that's the key point, because I think, as you were talking, I was thinking the pharmacy here, the retail pharmacy, the value of it is supposed to be beyond just being able to dispense medicines, but it's supposed to be talking to you about side effects of your medication, whatever other concerns you might have. But that doesn't happen. You go to the pharmacy, you pick up your medicine, and attached to it is a list of the potential drug interactions and things that you shouldn't do when you're on but there's no conversation with the pharmacist. So I think that's where the vacuum that these, online pharmacies step into, because that's how people see the transaction with getting this.
Right. They've been conditioned for it to be transactional.
They've been
And this was
conditioned
my
for it to be
earlier point. I think
right,
that, pharmacy, particularly pharmacy owners, and particularly also the smaller independents or the smaller groups, need to think about how they can move up the value chain and capture more of that value. What
right.
is the value of advice and how does it all get monetized? I think there is interesting opportunities for business model innovation in pharmacy to address that exact issue.
Agreed.
But like we always say, it's all about the consumer, it's all about the customer, right? If the customer is, or the consumer, the patient is at some level dissatisfied, even if they don't know that they're dissatisfied, and the younger generation is much more transactional. They're going to be much more willing to operate in a world where, they don't want to deal with the pharmacy, they don't want to wait in line, they just want
Right.
their medication delivered. They want the information, to your point, delivered, and then they go on their merry way. Whereas, the elderly generation tends to often use pharmacy as a social experience and things like that. So, there is this change in demographics plays a role here too.
Hmm.
Well, we're just about out of time, Rondo. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think this was a great conversation. I really believe that there's opportunity for some of these new players in the pharmacy space here in the U.S. to get a bigger stronghold over time, as long as they continue to focus on what's right for the consumer. I like the Mark Cuban's approach to being transparent around pricing and being able to provide that to consumers. I would use it. Like I said, I already use an online delivery platform. So I would certainly consider it.
Very good. Well, let's wrap up here, and thanks so much for your insights on the
Likewise.
pharmacy industry, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next go around. Have a great
Sounds
one.
you too. Bye bye.
All the best.